are men. We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be driven or beaten as such.
The largest prison uprising in United States history isn't mentioned in history books. The Attica Prison Riot of 1971 is one of the darkest moments in the history of the U.S. prison system. Multiple levels of government abused the rights granted to it by its citizens and failed to fulfill its responsibility to protect the rights of not only its incarcerated population, but the public at large.
I was transferred to Attica in January 1971 from Sing Sing, Oslink, which is known now as Oslink Correctional Facility. And when I got into Attica, I seen that this was, from the time I got off the bus, me and about 40 other people that was transferred, seen that this was the roughest place I've ever seen in my life.
Conditions at Attica Correctional Facility were inhumane. Inmates received 1 roll of toilet paper each month and 1 shower a week. Inmates paid roughly 60 cents a day for meals consisting mainly of bread and pork, considered unclean by the large Muslim population. Prison riots had erupted throughout New York City. The government has the right to incarcerate those who are found guilty of a crime, but it also has the responsibility to treat those prisoners humanely. Inmates demanded basic human rights and improved living conditions. They hoped that the American public would pressure the government to fulfill its responsibilities to the inmates. At Attica, inmates formed the Attica Liberation Faction, ALF, to advocate for their rights. Influenced by other civil rights activists of the time, they looked for support from activist groups such as the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam, as they organized hunger strikes and wrote petitions. The animosity in the prison system reached its breaking point when George Jackson, a Black author and activist, was killed by a guard at San Quentin Prison. The contentious climate within Attica mirrored the racial and social tensions raging throughout the nation. The inmate population was disproportionately made up of people of color. The prison guards were primarily white. Hostilities came to a head the night after George Jackson's murder when guards dragged 2 Attica inmates from their cells, brutally beat them, and sent them to isolation in retaliation for a minor infraction earlier that day.
The next day, the guys that was on the same jail company or housing company where these 2 guys was pulled out of was coming back from the mess hall, and they was told that they was not going to the yard for their morning recreation. They was going back to the cell blocks. And that was the spark that started the whole thing.
The inmates took advantage of their position and took the prison guards hostage and released the other inmates into the prison yard. ALF leaders recruited inmates to oversee food distribution, communication, hostage protection, and defense. Then inmates drew up a manifesto of demands for basic human needs not being met by the prison, such as access to medical care and healthy food. The ALF requested the presence of an observers committee. The inmates wanted to ensure that their demands and concerns were accurately represented to the public. Government officials reported that the inmates were severely mistreating the hostages. Dr. Warren Hansen was sent in to evaluate the condition of the hostages and found that in reality, the inmates were prioritizing the hostages' well-being, protecting the same guards that routinely beat, intimidated, and insulted them.
Both the inmates and the hostages are in excellent condition. They have many minor injuries, but nothing serious. Nobody is suffering.
William E. Quinn, a prison guard, was badly beaten during the initial uprising and died of his injuries 2 days later. Government officials used his death as a way to sway public opinion in favor of using extreme force to take back the prison. As events were still unfolding, Commissioner Oswald was instructed to announce only the state-sanctioned version of events.
Well, first I saw the hostages. I had a chance to look at them, and they were badly beaten, and they had cloths over their eyes, blinding them,
Until the 4th day of the uprising, members of the Observers Committee believed that a compromise could be reached without bloodshed. But the situation escalated and negotiations ceased as more than 1,000 law enforcement officers descended on the prison. 3,000 rounds of tear gas were released into the prison yard. Gas masks made communication among state troopers nearly impossible. They carried no radios. The government has the right and the responsibility to put down insurrections. However, it also has the responsibility to take precautions to limit casualties. Scholars and witnesses continue to highlight the government's mismanagement of the situation. It could have been resolved without bloodshed.
They felt like they could murder these men and get away with it. And it was more important to stop this rebellion and make their point than it was even to protect their own employees. You know, it wasn't just inmates who were murdered. They murdered their own employees, and all of them were citizens of the state of New York. All of them were supposed to be looked after in one way or another by the governor, and he chose to kill them instead.
Retaliation against surviving inmates was swift in the days following the massacre. Inmates were tortured, forced to crawl through the mud, and made to run the gauntlet. An ordeal forcing prisoners to run through a formation of guards while being beaten with police batons. The cover-up began immediately. Commissioner Oswald reported to journalists outside the prison that the inmates had viciously cut the hostages' throats. In reality, autopsies had proven they had all died from police gunfire. In an attempt to implicate the inmates, the hostages' throats had been cut after death.
I spent a lot of time with Liz Fink, and Liz had preserved this archive. The state of New York has been saying for 50 years that this evidence doesn't exist, that it was destroyed, whatever the case may be. And
every level of government failed in their responsibilities to the inmates of Attica. The Commissioner of Corrections spread disinformation and insisted that the uprising was premeditated. Governor Rockefeller refused to directly address or take responsibility for the crisis. Even President Richard M. Nixon condoned the massacre.
And I said, I just want you to know that I have told Governor Rockefeller yesterday that I supported him, and that was that.
In the aftermath of the massacre, 2 investigations were launched. The first was led by government officials, resulting in charges against 62 inmates. 1 state trooper was indicted for reckless endangerment. Although a whistleblower reported that his superiors were hiding evidence of wrongdoing by law enforcement, the official report found there was no intentional cover-up, only serious errors in judgment. By investigating itself, the government demonstrated a clear conflict of interest during proceedings.
Or in the words of the Ninth Circuit in the recent Jepson decision, the executive cannot be its own judge.
The second investigation was led by an independent commission out of NYU Law School, known as the McKay Commission. In direct contrast to the first report, the McKay Commission severely criticized the governor's handling of the affair. Regardless, most government employees responsible for the atrocities at Attica were never held accountable.
And in the event that everything finally breaks down and there's a decision to go in with guns, that it must be very carefully planned. The Attica takeover, our commission concluded, was not well planned and resulted in more deaths than were necessary.
Civil rights lawyers Elizabeth Fink and William Kunstler fought to bring accurate information about the uprising to the public. Fink later sued the state of New York on behalf of the Attica inmates. In 2000, after decades in court, the state settled for $12 million, but issued no apology or admission of responsibility. Efforts to bury information about the Attica massacre continue. Dr. Heather Ann Thompson's 2017 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Blood in the Water, includes government records previously unavailable to the public. In cases of public safety or national security, the government may need to exercise its right to withhold information from the public. Attica met neither requirement. Still, information was kept buried for decades. Dr. Thompson filed lawsuits after her book was banned from several state prison systems, including New York. The citizens of the United States grant the government the power necessary to create a stable society, but these rights come with the responsibility to protect and provide for its people. It is the people's responsibility and right to hold the government accountable. The people must stand with each other regardless of race, beliefs, or status. They must remember the wrongs of the past to prevent the same in the future. Attica was one piece of a larger movement leading to prison reform around the United States. These demonstrations inspired laws that focused rehabilitation on education and counseling, ensured medical care, provided systems to report grievances, prevented overcrowding, and funded research to improve the prison system. Unfortunately, many of those reforms were repealed during the tough-on-crime era of the 1980s and 90s. We must continue to speak out like L.D. Barkley, advocate like Liz Fink, and report like Heather Thompson.